I'm thankful that we live in a place that feels safe. Kirkland Lake is not a war zone. It's not prone to earthquakes and hurricanes and flooding, as far as I've experienced since I've been here. There's not a lot of social unrest. And so sometimes it's easy for us to start taking our physical safety for granted. And that's something that maybe most of us have enjoyed for most of our life. I remember the one time I couldn't take my physical safety for granted. When I was living in South Korea in 2010, the North Korean government or army sank a South Korean submarine. And that resulted in, you can imagine, a diplomatic tiff between the two countries that caused a lot of tension and caused me to fixate on the idea that I was within artillery range of the North Korean border. So if things really boiled over in a hurry, it would be very, very difficult to get out, especially considering that most people believe if the North attacked the South, it would start with an artillery barrage of Seoul and its suburbs. So we often organize our lives around the need to be safe, and that's a good thing, like wear your seatbelts. Nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, do we do the same thing with our spiritual life? What is spiritual safety? We have to ask ourselves that question. And in today's passage, we're looking at two I am statements by Jesus in very close succession here in John chapter 10. And in this passage, Jesus talks about what it means to be safe spiritually. So read with me in John chapter 10, verses 7 to 16. Therefore, Jesus said again, very truly, I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen, and I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. Now, in this passage, the sheepfold very clearly means the gathering of people who are the people of God. In Jesus' context, this might be the gathering of the faithful in the worship of God at the temple, but it certainly prefigures the gathering of the faithful in the church. I don't know that it's too much of a metaphorical leap to say that that's what he's talking about. Now, we might believe that in the confines of the church, we find physical and spiritual safety. But Jesus points out that there have been thieves who've come to steal and kill and destroy. In his context, he's talking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are supposed to be the spiritual shepherds of Israel, but who have taken advantage of the people, who care nothing for the people that they are supposed to be looking at, and he's contrasting it with himself, who lays down his life for his sheep. But the four walls of the church ought to be safe, but it turns out they aren't always. In the last few weeks, the scandal surrounding the abuses of deceased apologist Ravi Zacharias have come to light. His own ministry now reports that he was a serial abuser of women. And so a person that we trusted, perhaps, many of us would have trusted, turns out to have been a thief. I'm affected by this scandal more than some of the others that I've heard in recent years because I personally know one of the victims. But it's not a new thing that somewhere along the line an important Christian leader turns out to be a predator rather than the person that we thought they were. And so if we think that inside the walls of the church that we are going to find spiritual safety, well, I hope that we often are not disabused of this notion, but there are going to be times and places where people are going to discover that the church itself is not so safe, that our safety does not come from the walls. Instead, our safety comes from the oversight of the shepherd. We might think that the church is a safe place in which spiritually immature people come in, are allowed to mature, and then are sent out into the world to serve God. But that's not what Jesus says. He says that they will come in and go out and find pasture. In other words, the life of believers is not simply confined to the sheep pen, but it also involves going out into the world, into the pasture, as it were. As sheep, we cannot be sustained in the pen. While the pen feels safe at times, if we believe that it is in the presence of the shepherd who leads us into the pasture that we are safe, then actually our own spiritual well-being depends on our following Jesus into the world to engage in mission. Now, first of all, I'm not saying that what we do here in the church is not valuable. The writer of Hebrews says, "Let us consider how we may spur one another towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching." But our formation as disciples of Jesus is not something that can be completed within the walls of the church. Jesus seems to be saying that an important part of our nourishment as his followers is something that we can only get by engaging with the world. So it's not to say that we grow up in the church so that we can serve in the world. In an important way, we grow up in the world so that we can serve in the church and in the world. Practically, this makes sense. We cannot wait for spiritual perfection to engage in mission. If I ask for a show of hands, how many people in this room are spiritually perfect? Yeah, me neither. If we waited for spiritual perfection, then mission would have ceased the moment that Jesus ascended into heaven. And if we look at the way that Jesus engages his disciples, we see a different pattern. He calls together a ragtag group of spiritual zeros and calls them his disciples. He teaches them, but he doesn't perfect them before he sends them out 2 by 2 to announce the coming kingdom, to heal the sick, and to cast out the demons. In this same way, Jesus sends us, before we have been perfected, into the world in mission. Why is that? Well, I believe that it is essential to our spiritual growth to actually be out in the world. If you think about it, what is spiritual growth? I think that this is tied to the Great Commandment. When Jesus is asked what the greatest commandment is, he says that it's to love God and to love people. And when we look at spiritual maturity, the mark of a spiritually mature person is that they love God, that they've learned to trust him in his goodness and to serve him, and that they have learned how to love and serve other people. So when God asks us to step out of our comfort zones and into different places, what happens? Well, the first thing is if I am asked to step into a role that I don't feel adequate for, but I'm forced to do it anyways, I learn that it is God who is working through me, that God empowers me. If God asks me to step into some role in ministry, to go out and reach out to a certain group of people that I'm not comfortable with, and he sustains me, then I begin to understand that I can trust God. He's faithful. And then I can trust him when he calls me to do something harder. And so it is only in allowing God to call us to do the difficult things and seeing his faithfulness through those that we learn to trust God and to obey him. But it's also true that we need to learn how to love people in a whole bunch of different circumstances. If I want to buy a new house, I would go to a lawyer who knows real estate law. Because if I go to a personal injury lawyer or a criminal lawyer and ask them to help me deal with the paperwork necessary to do a house, They don't really know what they're doing, do they? Because they're specialists. They're not generalists. The law is probably too big for any person to be a real generalist. When it comes to loving people, we are perhaps, if we are formed well, but in a sort of confined environment, we become specialists. We learn all about what it means to love people in the particular circumstances that we commonly encounter them. So we know what it's like to have to learn to love difficult people in church, perhaps. We know what it's like to have to love children if we have children of our own. But perhaps we have to step out into a wider array of life circumstances in order to learn to what it means to love people in new ways. I found this in my own life. When before the twins were born, I volunteered at a drop-in center in Belleville when we were living there. And at the drop-in center, we opened the doors to whomever would like to come in. And the kinds of people who came in were not the kind of people that I was working with, and they weren't the kind of people that I was used to worshiping with. Most of the people who came in were probably on welfare or disability. Many of them had mental health challenges or addiction issues, or both. And so it was in learning how to practically love those sorts of people, the people that I wouldn't normally encounter, that I become more proficient in the act of loving people. So a very practical example is one day a guest who'd been coming into the drop-in center for a number of months told us that the next time that he came in, he was going to be she. And the next week or the week after, whenever we saw this person again, she had flowing blonde locks and a new wardrobe and a new name. And I can sit here and talk about the morality of transgenderism, but really, when we encounter that person, that's really beside the point. Our job is to show God's loving, gracious hospitality, not to judge their heart. That is really for God to do. And so we learn in these difficult and unusual circumstances, often clumsily, what it means to love people in new and different and novel and unpredictable circumstances. And that process of learning to love people, different people, is an important thing in what it means for us to grow in the ability to love other people. We need to become generalists in loving others. We can't simply remain specialists. And so, spiritual safety involves following the shepherd into the field, because in those places we learn how to trust in God and we learn how to love other people in new ways. Another area of our own comfort often has to do with the fact that we worship with people who are often very much like us. The church is meant to be an expression of the diversity of humanity. John, in Revelation, talks about seeing a great multitude from every tongue and tribe and nation worshiping the Lamb. But oftentimes, our churches fall woefully short of this vision. We tend to cloister ourselves into communities of people of similar age, ethnic background, theological outlook, socioeconomic classes. And, this is bound to happen on some level, but Jesus talks about the fact that he has sheep in other pens. In this context, he's talking, of course, about the Gentiles. The earliest church was a sect within Judaism, and everything was working fine until the Holy Spirit called a centurion and his family, they were Gentiles, and poured out the Spirit on them. And suddenly the Jewish believers had to figure out what they were going to do with the fact that God had sort of circumvented the process and invited a whole bunch of people that they didn't think should come in. God had explained what it meant to worship him. And part of that was some of the things that are at the heart of what it means to be Jewish. The observance of the Sabbath day, kosher diet, circumcision for the men. And so there was a debate. The first major debate in the church on theology had to do with whether or not the Gentiles could be included. And the church leaders discerned together that God's will was that people did not need to become culturally Jewish in order to worship God. Now, I think that all of us are benefits of that decision. But at the same time, we can do the same thing that the early legalists did. We can create a cultural boundary that says, if you want to worship Jesus, it looks like this. When I was at the drop-in center, there were people there who claimed to be Christians, but their lifestyle looked very different than the lifestyle of the kind of people that I would worship with. And we could get hung up on some of these things. It's like, oh my goodness, they smoke. Or, they use salty language. And sometimes we can start to say, are these things the real moral issues that define the who's in and who's out in the kingdom? Or do we understand them in cultural light? People speak like that because that's how they've always been taught to speak. And people smoke because that's something that is very common in their socioeconomic backgrounds. Now, setting aside the wisdom of that, what I would say is, do we make space in our community as a gathering of believers for people whose expression of faith looks different than our own? Do we accept the fact that when this flock is called together, one flock with one shepherd, that it's going to look different than our Sunday morning gatherings are going to look? And so our spiritual safety can feel like it is based in this familiarity, but Jesus calls us into something less familiar, but he calls us to trust him. So all of this really brought together says that there are ways of worshiping that seem safe to us, that feel familiar, and that we enjoy. And that Jesus is saying that if we want to be his disciples, if we want to grow into mature Christians, that we need to be willing to set aside what is familiar and what is comfortable to go into the world and engage in loving people that are different and in letting people into our time worshiping together and into our identity of us that don't look like us. So the shepherd is asking us to go on an adventure. It is not an adventure that is maybe as comfortable as the adventure that we would like. Sometimes it's nice just to stay in the pen. But it is the presence of our shepherd, not the walls of the pen, that make us safe. And so if you are at church and you want to grow spiritually, and I hope you do, and I trust that you do, we have to know that Bible studies, small groups, sermons, worship services, all of these things are important, but they alone will not allow us to become spiritually mature. Spiritual maturity happens when we put the things that we've learned into practice. In much the same way that if you are a co-op student in a university program, you come into the program and you learn the theory, and then you go out and you do the job. And it's in the job, in putting what you learned into practice, that it really becomes a part of who you are and what you know how to do. So that's what Jesus is calling us to. He's calling us to a co-op program, if you will, of spiritual maturity. He's our shepherd, and he's calling us out into the world. Are we willing to follow?